You think you can fix it, old man?" The voice was sharp, almost mocking, echoing across the tarmac of the military base. The words hung in the air, cutting through the tension like a knife. Jack Harper, a man well into his 70s, stood off to the side, his gaze unwavering as he watched the young engineers struggle with the F-16. The machine, a relic of the past, sat motionless, its sleek design marred by a mechanical failure that no one could seem to fix. The engineers circled around the aircraft, their faces a mixture of frustration and defeat. Jack had seen this before. He had seen men much younger than him, full of arrogance and pride, struggle to solve problems they didn't understand. The young engineers, with their modern tools and tech-heavy solutions, didn't realize that sometimes, the answer wasn't in the machines themselves, but in the experience of the people who had been there long before this technology was ever built. The lead engineer, Mike Tanner, waved his hand in the air in exasperation. "This thing's not going anywhere. Maybe it's time to call in the experts." The words were barely out of his mouth when Captain Sarah Wilson walked over, her boots clicking sharply against the concrete. She looked over the scene, assessing the engineers and their futile attempts. Her eyes then landed on Jack. "Harper," she said calmly, her voice steady but carrying authority. "Can you fix it?" Jack didn't respond right away. He simply took a step forward, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn jacket. The engineers exchanged glances, some suppressing snickers, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The room was thick with doubt, but Jack remained unfazed. He had worked on machines like this before, long before they had polished software and high-tech diagnostics. He had worked on them in the heat of battle, with lives on the line, in places where there was no time for second chances. "Let's see what you can do, old man," Mike muttered under his breath, clearly unconvinced. Jack didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge the challenge. Instead, he walked slowly towards the F-16, his eyes scanning the aircraft, taking in every detail. He crouched by the engine, lifting the panel with practiced ease. The engineers watched, some with curiosity, others with thinly veiled skepticism. Jack's hands moved with a rhythm that spoke volumes. He didn't need to rush. He didn't need to shout about his experience. The way he worked, slow, deliberate, calm, was all the proof anyone needed. As he continued to inspect the engine, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch, something he had carried with him for decades. The pouch, though weathered, was a piece of his history. Jack opened it with the care of someone handling something far more precious than metal tools or wrenches. Inside were small, simple tools, ones that had seen countless days in the heat of the battlefield. The engineers exchanged looks, and Mike couldn't help but let out a scoffing laugh. "What's that, Grandpa?" "Your magic kit." Jack ignored him, instead focusing on the task at hand. His hands were steady as he applied a small tool to a section of the engine. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't quick, but it was exactly what was needed. After a moment, the F-16's engine roared to life, its turbine spinning with a powerful hum. The sound was unmistakable. The young engineers stood frozen, their mouths slightly open in disbelief. Mike stepped back, his pride shattered. "Impossible," he whispered under his breath, unable to comprehend what he had just witnessed. Jack stood up, his hands wiping off the oil and grease, his face expressionless. "It's all about knowing the machine," he said simply, his voice low but carrying an undeniable weight. The engineers were silent. They had been so sure that their modern methods, their tools, and their knowledge would fix the problem. But in the end, it wasn't about any of that. It was about the experience, the skill, and the calm of a man who had lived through far worse than a malfunctioning fighter jet. Captain Wilson, standing to the side, let out a small sigh of relief, her face a mask of respect. "Good work, Harper," she said, her voice firm. And just like that, the room was no longer filled with doubts. It was filled with the quiet recognition of what true experience meant. The sound of the engine roaring to life echoed across the tarmac, filling the air with a hum of power. The young engineers stood motionless, staring at the F-16 as it came to life under the hands of the old man, Jack Harper. The disbelief was palpable, hanging in the air like a thick fog. Mike Tanner, the lead engineer, was the first to speak, his voice faltering. How did you do that? Jack didn't look at him. Instead, he wiped his hands on a rag, his expression unchanged. It's all about understanding the machine. Knowing what makes it tick. His words were simple, but they carried weight. The engineers had spent hours, using every tool and trick they knew, but it had taken Jack only minutes to solve the problem. Mike stood there, stunned, unable to comprehend how someone from a bygone era could still be the solution to their modern-day dilemma. I don't get it, Mike muttered, shaking his head. This is an F-16. It's not like anything you worked on. Jack finally turned to face him, his eyes steady and calm. You're right, he said softly. It's not the same. But the principles are. The machines might change, but the basics, those stay the same. The engineers exchanged glances, still processing what had just happened. Captain Sarah Wilson, who had been quietly observing the scene, stepped forward. She glanced at the aircraft and then at Jack. You've still got it, she said, her voice filled with respect. I never doubted you for a second. Jack gave a small nod. It's not about being fast or flashy. It's about knowing what to do when it counts. The room fell silent, the gravity of his words sinking in. The engineers had learned a lesson that went beyond just fixing an aircraft. They had learned that experience, knowledge, and skill weren't things that could be measured by modern technology. They were earned through years of hands-on work, in the heat of the moment, in places where there was no room for error. I think we all have a lot to learn, one of the younger engineers said quietly, his voice full of humility. We've been so focused on the technology, we forgot what really makes it work. Jack didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned back to the F-16, looking at it with a sense of quiet satisfaction. Technology is a tool, he said, his voice low but firm. But it's the people who use it that make the real difference. The engineers nodded, a new sense of respect dawning on them. Jack wasn't just some old veteran, he was a living reminder that true expertise was timeless. As they gathered around the aircraft, ready to continue their work, the lesson had been learned. The old man had come through when they needed him most, not with the latest gadgets or flashy software, but with something far more valuable, wisdom and experience. Jack Harper, the quiet veteran, had just reminded them all that some things never go out of style. The hours that followed were filled with a new sense of purpose. The F-16 stood on the tarmac, humming softly, ready to take flight once more. The engineers had returned to their work, but now, there was a noticeable shift. Where there had once been arrogance, there was now respect. Mike Tanner, who had been the most vocal in his doubt, now found himself watching Jack Harper with a quiet reverence. He hadn't expected the old man to know what to do, let alone fix the problem so effortlessly. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the base, Captain Sarah Wilson stood next to Jack, watching the engineers work. You've made your point, Harper, she said, her voice calm but carrying a hint of admiration. Jack didn't respond at first, instead, he simply watched the young engineers, their movements now more purposeful, more confident. It wasn't about proving anything, Jack replied after a long pause. It's about them realizing that they can't do everything on their own. The machines will fail them, but they'll always have their experience to fall back on. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. I think they get it now. The air was still, except for the distant hum of the aircraft engines, as the engineers finished their work. There was no more laughter, no more mocking. The F-16 was ready for its test flight, and the team knew they had the right tools at their disposal. But more importantly, they had learned the value of experience and humility. Mike approached Jack, his hands tucked into his pockets. Hey, thanks, he said, his voice hesitant. I didn't think you'd actually pull it off. Jack smiled slightly, his eyes still focused on the aircraft. It wasn't about pulling it off. It was about knowing where to look and what to do when it's your turn. Mike hesitated for a moment before speaking again. You've taught us something today. About more than just fixing a plane. About what it means to be good at what you do. Jack's smile grew. A little more. Just remember, it's not about being the best. It's about being good enough to get the job done, no matter what. Mike nodded, his respect for the old veteran growing by the second. As the team gathered around the F-16, preparing for the test flight, Jack stepped back, content to let them take the spotlight for this moment. He had done his part, and now, it was their turn. The F-16 roared to life once again, soaring into the sky. The engineers watched, a newfound respect for the old man in their eyes. They had been humbled, but they had also learned something invaluable. Experience was more than just knowledge, it was the kind of wisdom that could never be taught by a textbook or learned through a screen. It was earned in the trenches, in the real world, through years of hard work and dedication. And as the aircraft climbed higher into the sky, the young engineers stood in silent acknowledgement of the lesson they had just been given. Jack Harper, the old veteran, had proven that some things, experience, skill, and respect, could never be replaced by technology. The following day, the atmosphere at the base had shifted in subtle but significant ways. The engineers worked with a new sense of purpose, their movements more coordinated, their focus sharper. There were fewer whispered doubts and more determined conversations about the future of their projects. The F-16, once a symbol of their failure, now stood as a reminder of what they had learned in the past 24 hours. Jack Harper, as usual, remained in the background, quietly observing but never interrupting. He had done what was needed, and now it was their turn to carry the weight forward. Mike Tanner, still somewhat in awe of the old veteran, approached him during a break. "You really do have a way with machines," Mike said, his voice filled with newfound respect. "I've been in this field for over a decade, and I never thought there'd be anything a guy like me could learn from someone like you." Jack glanced over at Mike, his face unreadable but his eyes softening. "It's not about being better than anyone," Jack replied. "It's about being willing to learn from everyone, no matter their age, no matter how much time has passed. There's always something new to pick up, even from the things that seem like they're long gone." Mike thought about that for a moment before responding. "I've been too caught up in what I know, and I guess that's been holding me back. Thanks for opening my eyes." Jack gave a small nod, his gaze shifting to the work in front of them. "Everyone has their strengths," he said simply. "Your strength is knowing the machines. Mine is knowing when to step back and let them teach you something you don't already know." It was a simple statement, but Mike could feel the weight behind it. Jack wasn't just talking about the machines. He was talking about life. After their brief exchange, the young engineers continued their work, but there was something different in the air. It wasn't just the hum of the machines or the sound of tools clanking against metal. It was the feeling of a team coming together, learning from each other, and building something stronger than they could on their own. As the day wore on, Captain Sarah Wilson returned to the team's work area. She had been in meetings most of the morning, but now she took a moment to watch the engineers at work. It was clear that things had changed. They were more focused, more engaged. She caught Mike's eye and nodded approvingly. "I see you've all been busy," she said, her tone light but with an edge of approval. Mike smiled, but it was a different kind of smile than before. "We've learned a lot," he said. "More than we thought we would." Sarah didn't press further. She knew that the lesson had been learned, not just in fixing the F-16 but in something deeper, something that couldn't be measured by a checklist or a tool. "Good," she said, turning to Jack. "And you, Harper? How do you feel about all this?" Jack simply shrugged, his expression as calm as ever. "I feel like I did my part. Now, it's time to let them do theirs." The rest of the day passed with an easy rhythm. The engineers finished their tasks, each one taking pride in what they had accomplished. The work was no longer just about fixing machines, it was about understanding the value of patience, experience, and the willingness to step aside and let someone else take the lead. As the sun set over the base, casting long shadows across the tarmac, the F-16 stood ready, a symbol of the lessons learned and the respect earned. Jack Harper, the quiet veteran, had given them more than just a lesson in mechanics. He had given them a lesson in life. The days that followed were quiet but filled with a noticeable change. The engineers, now more attuned to their work and each other, had developed a kind of camaraderie that hadn't been there before. They were no longer just co-workers trying to meet deadlines, they were a team that respected one another, learning from each other's strengths and weaknesses. The lessons Jack had taught them, though simple, had made a lasting impact. Mike Tanner found himself thinking more before jumping into a solution. He had been the most skeptical of Jack's presence at first, but now he understood the depth of experience the old man carried. Jack, on the other hand, remained as he always was, quiet, focused, never seeking recognition, content to be in the background. It was a sunny afternoon when Captain Sarah Wilson approached the team again, her boots echoing against the concrete as she walked toward the group. The engineers were gathered around a workbench, discussing a new issue they had encountered with another aircraft. Sarah watched them for a moment before speaking up. "How's everything going?" she asked, her eyes scanning the team. Mike looked up from the workbench, a smile tugging at his lips. "Better than expected," he replied. "We've made more progress in the past few days than we had in the past month." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You've really turned things around that fast." "Yeah," Mike said, his voice filled with a newfound confidence. "The whole team's been more focused, more connected. And I think we're getting better at working together." Sarah turned her attention to Jack, who was sitting off to the side, looking over some blueprints. "And what about you, Harper?" she asked. "How do you feel about everything?" Jack didn't immediately respond. He took a moment, as if weighing the question carefully, before finally looking up. "I've done my part," he said quietly. "It's not about fixing planes or fixing people. It's about helping them see what they're capable of when they stop looking at their tools and start looking at each other." Sarah smiled, nodding. "I think they're finally seeing that," she said. "And I think they're learning more than just how to fix machines. They're learning how to be a team." For the first time, Jack allowed himself a small smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show that he was content with the progress they had made. The team continued to work, their progress steady and their spirits high. The F-16 that had once been a symbol of failure now stood as a testament to their growth. It wasn't just the aircraft that had been fixed, it was the entire team, working together, learning from their mistakes, and respecting the experience that each person brought to the table. As the sun set behind them, casting a warm golden glow across the base, the team stood back and admired the aircraft. It was ready. But more than that, they were ready. Ready to face whatever came next, together. And Jack, standing quietly off to the side, knew that the lessons he had taught them would stick with them far longer than the repairs he had made. In a world where technology was constantly evolving, the importance of experience, of knowing when to trust your instincts and when to rely on your teammates, was something that could never be replaced. The following week, the base was quieter. The usual hum of activity filled the air, but there was something different now. The team had come together in ways they hadn't expected, and even Captain Sarah Wilson noticed the subtle shift. There was a new energy among the engineers, one that hadn't been there before. They were working faster, with more precision, but more importantly, they were working together. Mike Tanner, who had once been the most skeptical about Jack Harper's involvement, now found himself seeking the old man's advice on more than just aircraft repairs. He was starting to understand the value of experience, and the quiet wisdom that came with it. One morning, after a successful test flight of another aircraft, Mike approached Jack, who was sitting outside near the hangar, enjoying the cool breeze. "Hey, Harper," Mike said, taking a seat next to him. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about experience and teamwork." Jack glanced at him, offering a small smile. "And what have you come to realize?" he asked, his voice steady. Mike paused for a moment, reflecting on the past week. "I think I've spent so much time focusing on what I know, what I can do, that I forgot about what I can learn from others. Especially from someone like you." Jack didn't respond immediately, instead watching the young engineers as they moved across the tarmac, working in unison. "You know, I wasn't always the person you see today," Jack said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. I wasn't born with all the answers. I learned them the hard way. But that doesn't mean I can't still learn something from someone else, no matter their age or experience. Mike nodded, understanding now what Jack had meant all along. It wasn't about the years you had under your belt, it was about how you used that time. You know, Mike said after a beat, I've spent a lot of time trying to prove myself, trying to show I can fix anything. But I think I've been going about it the wrong way. Jack looked over at him, his eyes filled with quiet understanding. It's not about proving anything to anyone, he said. It's about getting the job done, and learning how to do it better next time. The simplicity of Jack's words hit Mike harder than he expected. There was no grand lesson, no motivational speech, just a quiet truth that had taken him all week to understand. Thanks, Harper, Mike said, standing up. I think I've got a lot of work to do. Not just on the machines, but on myself too. Jack nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. We all do, he said. But that's the beauty of it. Every day is a new chance to learn. As Mike walked back to the work area, Jack watched him, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over him. He had done his part, and now the young engineers were carrying on the lessons he had taught them, not just about fixing machines, but about life. It was never just about what you could do alone, it was about the strength of the team, the willingness to learn from one another, and the respect you gave to the experience that everyone brought to the table. And as Jack sat there, watching the team work together, he knew that this was what truly made a difference. Not just the planes they fixed, but the way they learned to fix each other. As the weeks passed, the base began to hum with a new kind of energy. It wasn't just the aircraft that were getting fixed, it was the people. The engineers were more focused, more confident in their abilities, and that confidence had a ripple effect throughout the base. It was clear to Captain Sarah Wilson that something had changed in the way the team worked, something beyond just their technical skills. She found herself observing them more closely, watching how they interacted with one another, how they communicated without speaking, how they trusted each other's judgment. It was a subtle shift, but it was there, and it was enough to make Sarah feel a sense of pride in the team she had been leading. One afternoon, Sarah walked over to where Mike Tanner was working with the team on a new project. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the hangar, and the hum of the aircraft in the background seemed to provide a steady rhythm to the work. Mike looked up as she approached, a small smile forming on his face. "How's it going, Captain?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. Sarah smiled back, crossing her arms. "I think it's going better than expected," she said. "You all seem to be working together more efficiently. It's like you found a new rhythm." Mike nodded, glancing over at the others. "Yeah, we have. I didn't expect it to happen this fast, but I think we're all starting to understand what it really means to work as a team. It's not just about fixing machines anymore." Sarah raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And what is it about, then?" "It's about knowing that we're all in this together," Mike said, his voice more serious than usual. "We've been focused on the wrong things. It's not just the tools or the technology, it's the people. We've learned that the real strength is in how we work together, how we learn from each other, and how we respect each other's experience." Sarah's expression softened as she took in his words. She had always known the importance of teamwork, but hearing it from Mike, someone who had once been resistant to the idea, made her feel like the mission was truly succeeding. "You've come a long way," she said quietly, looking out over the hangar. "And so have all of you." Mike looked at her, a hint of gratitude in his eyes. "We couldn't have done it without you. And without him." He nodded toward Jack Harper, who was sitting off to the side, watching the team work with a quiet, steady gaze. Sarah followed his gaze and smiled. "He's the one who started it all," she said. Mike nodded again. "Yeah, he really is. I think we all get it now. It's not about being the smartest or the fastest, it's about being part of something bigger, something we all contribute to." The team continued to work in the background, their movements synchronized, their focus unwavering. It was a new kind of unity that had formed between them, one that went beyond just fixing planes. It was a bond of respect, trust, and shared purpose. As the sun set behind the base, casting an orange glow across the hangar, Sarah knew that the team was no longer just a group of engineers. They were a team in every sense of the word, and they were ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Jack Harper, the quiet veteran, had been the catalyst for this change. He had shown them that the true measure of success wasn't in the machines they fixed, but in the way they worked together to get the job done. And in that moment, as she watched the team continue to work with newfound confidence, Sarah couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. They had learned something valuable, something that would stay with them long after the repairs were completed. Weeks passed, and the steady hum of activity at the base continued. The team of engineers had grown accustomed to their new rhythm, the quiet confidence in their work becoming second nature. But there was something more that had taken root among them, a sense of pride in what they had achieved, not just in their work but in their transformation as a team. Captain Sarah Wilson watched as the engineers worked together, their conversations now more collaborative than ever, their problem-solving more fluid. It wasn't just about fixing aircraft anymore, it was about taking pride in what they did, in the knowledge that they were doing it as a unit, not as individuals. Mike Tanner, once the most resistant to change, found himself regularly seeking advice from his fellow engineers, no longer viewing his expertise as something to guard jealously. He understood now that their success came from their ability to lean on one another, to value the experiences each person brought to the table. One afternoon, Sarah approached Mike as he was finishing up a routine check on another F-16. "How's everything going?" she asked, crossing her arms as she observed the team. Mike looked up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Better than I thought it would," he replied, his tone lighter than before. "We've really started to click, all of us. And I think we're doing more than just fixing planes. We're building something stronger here." Sarah nodded, watching the engineers in motion. "You've all come a long way," she said, her voice filled with pride. "But you're right. It's not just about the aircraft. It's about what you've built as a team. You've learned to trust each other, and that's the kind of foundation that lasts." Mike smiled, glancing at Jack Harper, who was once again sitting off to the side, observing the team with a quiet sense of satisfaction. "Yeah, we've learned a lot from him," Mike said, his voice thoughtful. "He's the one who showed us that the job isn't just about knowing the machines. It's about understanding the people you work with. And when you learn that, you start to get better at everything else." Sarah followed Mike's gaze toward Jack. "He's the kind of man who doesn't need to say much to make an impact," she said. "But when he does speak, you know it's coming from a place of experience. You can't put a price on that." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the base, Sarah felt a deep sense of contentment. The change she had hoped for when she first brought Jack onto the team was now a reality. The engineers had not only learned to work together, they had learned to respect each other, to value the unique skills and experiences each person brought to the table. It was something that could never be taught in a classroom or learned from a manual. It was something that had to be lived, something that had to be earned. And as Sarah watched the team continue to work, she knew that this was just the beginning. They had built a foundation that would carry them forward, through any challenge that came their way. Jack Harper, the quiet veteran, had shown them that true strength didn't come from individual skill, but from the ability to work together, to learn from one another, and to respect the value that each person brought to the team. And in that lesson, they had all found something far more valuable than just technical expertise. They had found unity. Months passed, and the season shifted from the warm embrace of summer to the cooler breeze of fall. The base, once filled with tension and uncertainty, now felt alive with a sense of purpose. The engineers, once a fragmented team, were now united in ways they hadn't imagined possible. Their work on aircraft was more efficient, more precise, but more importantly, they had learned the power of collaboration. Captain Sarah Wilson stood at the edge of the hangar one late afternoon, watching the team work. The sound of tools clinking against metal, the hum of engines being tuned, the steady rhythm of a well-oiled team, it was all a testament to how far they had come. It wasn't just the machines that had been fixed. The people had been repaired, too. As Sarah watched, Mike Tanner approached her, a slight smile on his face. "Hey, Captain," he said, wiping his hands on his coveralls. "I've been thinking about how things have changed around here." Sarah turned to face him, a knowing look in her eyes. "I know what you mean," she said. "It's incredible to see how much you've all grown. You're not just engineers anymore. You're a team." Mike nodded, glancing over at the others working across the tarmac. "It's funny," he said. "We used to think it was all about the technology. The machines. The tools. But I've come to realize it's about the people. And it's about the respect we give each other." Sarah's eye softened. "Exactly. The tools and technology will always change, but the strength of the team? That's what carries you through. That's the foundation you build everything on." Mike smiled, his respect for Sarah evident in his expression. "You know, Captain, I wasn't sure about Jack at first. I thought he was just some old guy from the past. But now I get it. He's not just fixing planes. He's been fixing us." Sarah chuckled softly, watching as Jack Harper stood off to the side, observing the team as usual, his presence quiet yet steady. "Jack's been the catalyst for all of this," Sarah said. "But it's been you, Mike, and everyone else who's made it happen. You've taken what Jack showed you and turned it into something real." Mike looked at Sarah, his voice filled with sincerity. "I've learned a lot, Captain. And it's not just about fixing planes or solving problems. It's about how we approach everything. How we approach each other." As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light over the base, Sarah felt a deep sense of pride. She had watched this team evolve, not just into better engineers, but into better colleagues, better people. The change had been gradual, subtle, but it was undeniable. They had learned that true strength came not from individual talent, but from the ability to work together, to trust each other, and to respect one another's experiences. And in that moment, as she looked at the team working in the fading light, Sarah knew that this wasn't just a success in the work they had done. It was a success in the way they had come together. And as long as they held on to that, they would be unstoppable. Jack Harper had shown them the value of experience, of teamwork, and of quiet strength. And now, they were ready for whatever came next, together.